I need those keys, Mom.
Now.
No, I can't let you do this, son. Just give them to me.
Stop, please. Mom, come on. I won't let you throw your life away. I said, give them to me.
Don't tell me what to do, Mom.
But I need the car. I remember now.
My son stood in my kitchen with his hand out and said, "Mom, Rachel needs your car more than you do." I stared at Brian, waiting for him to smile. He didn't. Rachel's SUV was in the shop, and apparently her real estate clients required something presentable. When I asked how long they planned to keep my Lexus, Brian sighed like I was being difficult. "Mom, you barely go anywhere anymore." That sentence hurt more than he knew. I looked through the window at the Lexus my late husband had bought me before he died. Then I remembered the hidden compartment beneath the trunk floor, the one Edward had once told me never to forget. Brian thought he was taking my car. He had no idea what was locked inside it. Before I tell you what happened next, if you've ever had someone you love mistake your kindness for permission, please like this video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, was Brian already crossing a line, or would you have given him the car? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes it amazes me how far these stories travel. A car that was never just a car. 3 years before Brian stood in my kitchen asking for my keys, I had stood in almost the same place holding Edward's coffee mug and trying to understand how a house could still contain everything except the person who made it feel like home. My husband and I had been married for 41 years. Edward was not a romantic man in the way movies teach you to recognize romance. He rarely bought flowers because he thought they died too quickly. He forgot Valentine's Day twice during our marriage, and once he gave me a new vacuum cleaner for our anniversary. I didn't speak to him for half a day. But if it snowed, Edward warmed my car before I woke up. If I mentioned that the porch light flickered, it was repaired before dinner. And whenever I drove somewhere alone, even after 40 years of marriage, he would say, "Call me when you get there." That was Edward's version of love. The Lexus was part of that. We had never been extravagant people. I worked as a bookkeeper for a family-owned construction company in Richmond, Virginia, for nearly 30 years. Edward had spent most of his career managing commercial properties and investing cautiously in small local projects. We saved. We paid our bills. We discussed purchases over $50 as if Congress needed to approve them. So when Edward brought me to a Lexus dealership 6 years before he died, I thought he had lost his mind. "This is ridiculous," I whispered as we walked past rows of polished vehicles. "You haven't even seen the ridiculous part yet," he said. Then he showed me a silver Lexus RX. I remember touching the door handle and looking at the price sticker. Edward Tucker. Whenever I used his full name, he knew trouble was coming. He smiled. "Alice Tucker. We are not buying this. We already did." I stared at him. He had saved separately for almost 2 years. My old sedan had started giving us trouble, and Edward had quietly decided he wanted me in something safer. "You'll drive this longer than you'll have me around to worry about you," he said. I hated that sentence then. I hated it even more after he was gone. The Lexus became the last large gift my husband ever gave me. But it wasn't sitting unused in my driveway, like Brian seemed to believe. Every Sunday morning I drove myself to church. On Tuesdays I usually went grocery shopping before the stores became crowded. Twice a month I met Margaret Collins for lunch. I visited the public library so often that one of the librarians started setting aside new mystery novels she thought I would enjoy. I drove myself to the dentist, to the hair salon, to my annual physical. Sometimes I drove nowhere important at all. That mattered too. After Edward died, I learned that independence is often made of very ordinary things. Opening your own front door, choosing what time you eat dinner, driving to the store because you suddenly want peaches. Nobody thinks those things are precious until somebody else starts deciding whether you still need them. Brian had been good to me after his father died. At least that was how I saw it then. My only son was 42 and ran a home renovation company about 20 minutes from my house. He had always been ambitious. As a boy, he could turn a lemonade stand into a business meeting. Edward loved that about him. So did I. After the funeral, Brian started coming over every Saturday. He changed furnace filters. He checked smoke detectors. He trimmed a tree branch that hung too close to the roof. When the garbage disposal stopped working, Brian replaced it before I could call a plumber. I was grateful, maybe too grateful. There were little moments I didn't examine closely enough. Brian started saying things like, "Mom, just let me handle it." At first, those words felt comforting. Then he began saying them about things I hadn't asked him to handle. Insurance renewals, a contractor estimate, whether I should replace the back steps. Once he asked how much I still owed on the house. When I told him nothing, he whistled. That's a nice position to be in. I thought nothing of it. He was my son. That explanation covered more territory than it should have. Rachel was different from Brian. She was polished and social, always dressed as though she might unexpectedly meet an important client. She worked part-time in residential real estate and cared deeply about appearances. I didn't dislike her for that. She had grown up with very little, and I understood why looking successful mattered to her. Then one Thursday afternoon, Brian called me. "Mom, we've got a little emergency." I immediately thought something had happened to him. "What is it, Rachel's SUV?" I almost laughed from relief. Apparently the transmission had begun slipping badly. The repair shop needed to inspect it, and Brian said they might be without the vehicle for several days. Rachel had property showings scheduled. They needed a second vehicle. Then came the question. Could Rachel borrow the Lexus? I looked through my kitchen window at the car. For how long? 3 days. Maybe 4 tops. I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust Rachel with the vehicle. I simply had things to do. I need groceries Saturday. I'll take you. And church Sunday. I'll take you there too. He sounded so certain that there was no problem left to solve. I finally said, "All right, 3 days. You're saving us, Mom." Brian arrived that evening. Rachel was with him. She hugged me before I even handed over the keys. "Thank you, Alice. Seriously. You have no idea how much this helps. It isn't a gift," I teased. Rachel laughed. 3 days. Promise." I watched her adjust the driver's seat while Brian stood beside the car. For one strange second, I remembered Edward bringing the Lexus home. His hand had rested on the roof in almost exactly the same place Brian's rested now. Then Brian closed Rachel's door. "Don't worry about anything," he told me. Rachel backed out. The Lexus disappeared down the street. I stood in the driveway longer than I needed to. The house seemed quieter when I went inside, but I told myself I was being sentimental. It was a car. My daughter-in-law needed it. My son had asked. Families helped each other. Saturday morning, Brian drove me to the grocery store as promised. Sunday, he picked me up for church. Everything seemed perfectly normal. On Monday morning, the 3rd day, I expected a text telling me when they would return the Lexus. Nothing came. By lunchtime, I hadn't heard from either of them. At 4, I finally called Brian. He answered from what sounded like a busy job site. "Hey, Mom, everything okay? I was wondering when you're bringing my car back." There was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough for me to notice. "Oh, right. The Lexus." The way he said it bothered me, as though he'd forgotten the car belonged somewhere else. "The shop still hasn't finished looking at Rachel's SUV," he said. "Can we keep yours another couple days?" I looked at the empty space in my driveway. "You said 3. I know. I'm sorry. Just 2 more." I wanted to say no. Instead, I heard myself say, "All right, thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand." We hung up. I stood at the kitchen window staring at the empty driveway. At the time, I thought the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach was simply irritation. I didn't understand yet that 3 days had already become something else. And neither Brian nor Rachel had any intention of returning my car anytime soon. 3 days became 3 weeks. 2 more days became 4. 4 became 7. By the end of the first week, I had heard so many explanations about Rachel's SUV that I could have written the repair invoice myself. First, the shop was waiting for a part. Then they needed to run another diagnostic. Then Brian said the repair estimate was higher than expected, so he and Rachel were considering their options. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together they began to feel like a door being quietly closed in my face. On the 8th morning I called Brian. Any news about Rachel's car? Not yet. So when am I getting mine back? He sighed, not angrily. That almost made it worse. It was the tired sigh people use when someone asks the same unnecessary question too many times. Mom, Rachel has 3 showings this week. Can we not make this complicated? I looked at my calendar. I have a dental appointment Thursday. I'll take you. I don't need you to take me. I have a car. You know what I mean. Yes, I was beginning to. The Lexus was still mine when insurance was due, when registration needed renewing, and when maintenance had to be paid. But when I wanted to drive it suddenly, I was creating a complication. I want it back after Rachel's showings. We'll figure it out. That phrase stayed with me. We'll figure it out. Not I'll return your car. I ended the call before irritation turned into an argument. Thursday morning, Brian texted that a contractor had called an emergency meeting and he couldn't take me to the dentist. He offered to order me a rideshare. I stared at the message. Then I ordered one myself. The driver was perfectly pleasant. The trip was easy. But sitting in the back seat of a stranger's Toyota, while my own Lexus was somewhere across Richmond, carrying my daughter-in-law, bothered me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't about luxury. It was about choice. Edward understood that. After he became sick, there were months when his body took choices away from him one by one. He couldn't drive. Then he couldn't climb stairs easily. Eventually, even taking a shower required planning. I remembered him telling me once, "You don't notice freedom until you have to ask somebody for it." Now I understood exactly what he meant. Sunday was worse. Brian had promised to drive me to church, but Saturday night he called and said he and Rachel had plans with her clients. So Margaret picked me up. She pulled into my driveway at 8:30, lowered the passenger window, and looked pointedly at the empty space beside my house. Still no Lexus. Rachel's SUV isn't fixed. Margaret waited until I got inside. Then she said, "Alice, I didn't ask about Rachel's SUV. I fastened my seatbelt." "What are you getting at?" "I'm asking where your car is." "With Rachel." For how long? I didn't answer immediately. Margaret knew me too well. How long were they supposed to borrow it? 3 days. And how long has it been? 10. She gave me a look. "Don't." I didn't say anything. "You're saying plenty with your eyebrows." That made her laugh, but only for a second. Then her expression softened. "Alice, did they borrow your car or did they take it?" The question irritated me. They borrowed it. Then why don't you know when it's coming back? Because they're having trouble with Rachel's SUV. Margaret nodded slowly. All right. I could tell she didn't believe me. Or perhaps she believed me but thought I didn't believe myself. At church I tried to forget about it. After the service, a woman from our congregation named Linda approached me while Margaret was talking to someone else. "Your daughter-in-law is in real estate, isn't she?" "Yes, I thought so. I saw one of her posts online. She looks like she's doing well." Linda pulled out her phone. I expected to see a photograph of a house. Instead, I saw my Lexus. Rachel stood beside it in a cream blazer, smiling in front of a brick home with a for sale sign behind her. The caption was about helping clients find the lifestyle they deserve. There was nothing dishonest in the words. She hadn't claimed the Lexus belonged to her. But the photograph told its own story. The car was clean enough to shine. Rachel's leather work bag rested on the hood. She looked comfortable beside it. Natural. Like it belonged in her life. Linda smiled. "Very professional." "Yes," I said quietly. "Very." I didn't tell her the vehicle was mine. I didn't know why. Maybe I was embarrassed. That realization disturbed me more than the photograph. Why should I have been embarrassed? I hadn't done anything wrong. By the second week, Rachel had stopped giving me updates entirely. Everything came through Brian. Whenever I asked, there was another reason. On day 13, I needed groceries. Brian couldn't come. I used a delivery service. On day 15, I wanted to go to the library. I nearly called Margaret, then stopped myself because I hated feeling dependent on her. I stayed home instead. That evening, Brian called. He sounded cheerful. "How are you doing?" "Fine." "See, maybe not having to drive everywhere is kind of nice." I sat straighter. "What did you say?" "I just mean you can relax. Let people do things for you. I like driving. I know Mom. No, Brian. I don't think you do. He became quiet. Then he laughed lightly. Don't turn this into something it isn't. I looked out at my empty driveway. What is it then? Then we're just trying to get through a transportation problem. Then return my car tomorrow. Another pause. Rachel has appointments. So do I. What appointments? The question stopped me. Not because I didn't have an answer. Because I suddenly realized I was being asked to justify my need for my own property. It doesn't matter. I'm only asking. And I'm telling you I want my car. He exhaled. Mom, you barely go anywhere anymore. There it was again. The same idea. Only this time I heard what was underneath it. My life had become small enough in Brian's mind that my possessions could be reassigned to people whose lives seemed more important. Bring it back Friday, I said. We'll talk. No. We'll return it. His voice hardened slightly. Rachel needs it for work. And I need it because it's mine. Silence. Finally, he said, I'll see what I can do. I almost laughed. See what he could do. As if he needed permission from someone else. Friday came. No Lexus. Saturday came. Still nothing. By the beginning of the third week even I could no longer call the situation temporary. Then Rachel called me unexpectedly. For one hopeful moment I thought she was arranging to return the vehicle. Instead, she wanted to thank me. The Lexus has been such a lifesaver, she said. Honestly, I don't know what I would have done without it. When will your SUV be ready? She went quiet. Oh, we're probably not fixing it. I gripped the phone. What? The repair is ridiculous. Brian thinks we'd be throwing good money after bad. I walked slowly to the kitchen table and sat down. So you're selling it, probably. Brian's figuring everything out. And what will you drive? Another pause. Longer this time. Well, we're still discussing that. After we hung up, I remained at the table. Something had changed. The entire reason Rachel supposedly needed my Lexus was because her SUV was being repaired. Now the SUV wasn't being repaired at all. Yet nobody had told me. Nobody had returned my car. And apparently Brian was figuring everything out. That evening I called him. I spoke to Rachel. Okay, she said you're not repairing her SUV. Probably not. Then I want my Lexus back tomorrow. Mom, we're trying to decide the smartest way forward. For whose car? For everything. I felt a chill move through me. Brian, there is nothing to decide about my Lexus. He didn't answer. That silence told me more than any argument could have. 3 days had become 3 weeks, because somewhere along the way, my son had stopped thinking of my car as something he had borrowed. And for the first time, I wondered whether he was planning to give it back at all. The spare key. That night I slept badly. Every time I closed my eyes I heard Brian saying, "We're trying to decide the smartest way forward, we." There was something unsettling about that word. Brian and Rachel were apparently making decisions about transportation money and their future, while my Lexus had quietly become one of the pieces they were moving around the board. By 7 the next morning, I had made coffee I barely drank. I stood at the kitchen window looking at the empty driveway. Then a memory came to me. The spare key. Edward believed in spare keys the way some people believe in emergency savings. He had duplicates for everything: the house, the shed, the mailbox, even an old filing cabinet nobody had opened in years. When we bought the Lexus, he had insisted that the second key should never live inside my purse. If you lose your purse, Alice, you'll lose both your keys and your dignity at the same time. I had laughed at him. Now I walked into his old study. I still called it Edward's study, even though he had been gone 3 years. His desk remained against the wall beneath the window. I had removed some papers after his death, but I had never completely emptied the drawers. Part of me couldn't. Opening them felt like entering a room where he might still be waiting. I pulled out the top drawer. Pens, paper clips, old receipts, nothing. The second drawer contained warranty booklets and instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned. Then I opened the narrow drawer on the right. There was a small wooden organizer inside, and beneath it, wrapped in a faded blue handkerchief, was a Lexus key fob. I sat down in Edward's chair. For several seconds, I simply held it. It wasn't only relief I felt, it was embarrassment. I was 68 years old, sitting in my own house feeling relieved because I had discovered a way to access my own vehicle without asking my son. That realization hardened something inside me. I called Margaret. I need a favor. She didn't hesitate. What time? That was Margaret. No interrogation before loyalty. I told her I wanted to go to Brian's house that evening. You're taking the Lexus back, I haven't decided. She was quiet. Alice, I just want to see it. You own it. I know. I'm reminding you because you keep sounding like you need permission. I didn't answer. At 7:30 that evening, Margaret pulled into my driveway. The ride to Brian's house took 20 minutes. Neither of us spoke much. I kept the spare key in my hand the entire way. When we turned onto Bryan Street, I saw the Lexus immediately. It was parked in the driveway, clean, polished. Rachel had apparently taken better care of its appearance than she had of the promise to return it. Margaret parked 2 houses away. You want me to come? No. Stay here. I walked toward the Lexus. Each step felt strangely illicit. That angered me. I pressed the button. The lights flashed. Mine. I opened the driver's door. The first thing I noticed was the seat. It had been moved forward. Then the smell. Rachel's perfume. A floral scent I recognized from family dinners. I sat behind the wheel. My hands rested where they always had. For the first time in almost 3 weeks, something inside me settled. Then I began noticing what wasn't there. My sunglasses were gone from the center console. So were the peppermint candies I kept there. The reusable grocery bags behind the passenger seat were missing. The lightweight blue scarf I kept in the back for cold restaurants was gone. Even the little umbrella Edward had bought me was missing from the door pocket. None of those things were valuable. That wasn't the point. Someone had emptied me out of my own car. Rachel's belongings had taken their place. A travel mug sat in the cup holder. There were real estate brochures in the passenger door. A pair of expensive sunglasses rested in the console. A phone charger I didn't recognize was plugged into the dashboard. In the back seat were 2 pairs of shoes and a garment bag. This wasn't the inside of a borrowed car. It looked lived in, claimed. I heard Margaret's voice behind me. You okay? I hadn't heard her approach. Look at this. She leaned inside. Her expression tightened. Where's your stuff? I don't know. Did Rachel ask before taking it out? No. Margaret straightened. I think you should drive this home right now. I almost agreed. Then something stopped me. I want to see if my registration is still here. I opened the glove compartment. The owner's manual was there. The registration was there. Insurance card too. Then I noticed a folded sheet of paper underneath them. I pulled it out. At the top was the name of a dealership in Richmond. Below that were details about a silver Lexus RX, my Lexus, mileage, year, condition, estimated trade-in value. For a moment I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw a handwritten note beside the estimate. Possible equity toward replacement vehicle. My stomach tightened. Margaret. She took the page from me. I watched her read it. Her face changed. Alice, this isn't a repair estimate. I know. This is a trade appraisal. I know. Did you request this? No. Did you authorize Brian to know? Margaret looked toward the house. The curtains were closed. No one had noticed us. Take a picture. I pulled out my phone. My hands were trembling now. I photographed the front, then the back. Margaret checked the glove compartment for anything else while I looked through the center console. There was nothing more. I placed the dealership paper exactly where I had found it. Then I closed the glove compartment. Now are you taking the car? I looked toward Brian's house. Part of me wanted to. I imagined getting behind the wheel, backing out, and letting him wake the next morning to the same empty driveway I had been staring at for 3 weeks. But another part of me wanted answers before Brian knew I had discovered anything. Not tonight. Margaret stared at me. You're leaving it for now. Why? Because if I take it tonight, he'll know I'm suspicious. You are suspicious. I want to know what he's planning. Margaret folded her arms. He's planning something involving your car and a dealership. I think we've established that. She was right. But there was another reason I hadn't told her yet. Something had been bothering me since I sat behind the wheel. A memory. Edward kneeling beside the open trunk years ago. I walked to the back of the Lexus, pressed the button. The trunk lifted. Rachel had filled that too. A collapsible real estate sign. 2 reusable shopping bags that weren't mine. A cardboard box containing brochures. I moved one bag aside. The carpeted floor looked completely ordinary. But suddenly I remembered Edward's hands lifting part of it. Not the usual storage area. Something beneath it. Something he had altered. The memory came in fragments. Edward holding a flashlight, a small metal edge, his voice. "If you ever need what's under here, you'll remember." At the time I had rolled my eyes. "Edward, you're always hiding paperwork like the Russians are coming." He had laughed. I hadn't thought about that moment in years. Now standing in Brian's driveway, I touched the edge of the trunk floor. Margaret noticed. "What, Edward did something here? What do you mean there was a compartment?" Her expression changed. "What kind of compartment? I don't remember exactly." I started to lift the floor, then stopped. If there was something hidden beneath it, Brian's driveway was the last place I wanted to discover it. I lowered the carpet again. "What did Edward put in there?" Margaret asked. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "I told me there were important papers. It was near the end when he was sick. There were so many things happening." I closed the trunk. The Lexus beeped softly. For the first time that evening, the dealership paper stopped being the most frightening thing I had discovered. I suddenly wanted that vehicle somewhere safe. But I also needed to think. Margaret and I returned to her car. On the drive home, she didn't lecture me. She didn't need to. I kept looking at the photographs on my phone. The trade-in estimate. The handwritten note. Possible equity toward replacement vehicle. When Margaret dropped me off, she squeezed my hand. "Whatever they're planning, Alice, remember one thing. What you don't have to prove that you need something you own." I went inside. That night, I enlarged the photograph of the dealership document and stared at it until the numbers blurred. Brian hadn't just kept my car longer than promised. Someone had taken my Lexus to be evaluated. Someone was calculating what it could be worth toward another vehicle. And nobody had asked me. But underneath that anger was a second question now, one I couldn't shake. What had Edward hidden beneath the floor of my trunk? I had gone to Brian's house thinking I needed to find out what my son planned to do with my car. I came home realizing I might first need to discover what my husband had left inside it. Because whatever was happening, this was no longer about borrowing a Lexus. We were trying to help you. I waited until the next afternoon to call Brian. That was deliberate. The younger version of me would have confronted him the moment I found the dealership paper. I would have demanded an explanation while my anger was still hot. But 30 years of bookkeeping had taught me something useful. When numbers don't make sense, don't accuse anyone until you know what you're looking at. So I waited. I made breakfast. I took a walk around the neighborhood. I looked at the photographs of the trade-in estimate several more times. Then shortly after noon, I called my son. "Can you come by after work?" There was a pause. "Everything okay? I'd rather talk in person." "About what, the Lexus?" Another pause. "I can probably be there around 6. "Good. I didn't mention the spare key. I didn't mention visiting his driveway. And I certainly didn't mention the compartment Edward had built beneath the trunk floor." At 6:15, Brian walked into my kitchen carrying 2 coffees. He placed one in front of me. "Peace offering." "I didn't know we were at war." He smiled. "That's my mom." For a moment I saw the boy who used to come home from school with grass stains on both knees and somehow convince me his torn pants weren't his fault. It would have been easier if I had stopped loving him, but that's not how family betrayal works. The people who can hurt you deepest are usually the ones whose faces still contain every age you've ever loved them at. Brian sat across from me. "So what's going on?" I put my phone on the table. Then I opened the photograph. His eyes moved to the screen. He didn't touch it. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Where did you get that?" It wasn't the response I wanted. Not, "What is that?" Not, "I can explain." Where did you get that? I looked at him. So you know what it is? Brian leaned back. Mom, did you have my Lexus appraised for a trade-in? He rubbed his jaw. We were exploring options. You didn't answer my question. Yes. The word landed heavily between us. Why? Because Rachel's SUV isn't worth fixing. What does Rachel's SUV have to do with the value of my car? He looked at me as if the answer were obvious. Everything is connected. No, Brian, it isn't. He sighed. Can I explain without you getting upset? I'm already upset. That's exactly what I mean. I stared at him. He continued. Rachel needs a reliable vehicle for work. Her SUV is basically done. You have a vehicle that's worth a decent amount of money, but you barely put any miles on it. My mileage is irrelevant. I'm not criticizing you. You're evaluating my need for something I own. Brian leaned forward. Mom, listen. Nobody is trying to take anything from you. Then why was my car appraised without my permission? We wanted numbers before bringing you an idea. What idea? His hesitation answered before his mouth did. He wanted to sell my Lexus. Brian raised both hands. Not sell it and leave you without transportation. How generous. Come on. No, explain. He took a breath. There are smaller crossovers that would be easier for you. Safer. Better gas mileage. We could trade the Lexus, get you something appropriate, and use some of the remaining value toward replacing Rachel's SUV. For several seconds I couldn't speak. He had said it so calmly, as though he were explaining how to reorganize a closet. You want to downgrade my car so your wife can afford hers. That's not what I said. It is exactly what you said. I'm talking about using resources efficiently. Resources, I nearly laughed. My car is a resource now. The back door opened. Rachel walked in. I hadn't known she was coming. Hey, Alice. She looked at Brian, then at me. Clearly they had discussed this before arriving. You knew about this, I asked. Rachel set her purse down. We've talked about possibilities. Without me. We didn't want to bother you until we knew what made sense. There it was again. That careful language. Help. Practical. Makes sense. Words designed to make disagreement sound irrational. Rachel sat beside Brian. Alice, please don't think we're trying to take advantage of you. This could actually be good for everybody. For everybody. You'd still have a nice car. I already have a nice car. A smaller one might be easier. Easier for whom? Rachel glanced at Brian. He answered. Mom, you're 68. I felt something inside me go still. Yes, Brian. I was 68 yesterday too when you were driving a car registered in my name. You know what I mean? No. Explain what 68 means. His face tightened. Traffic is getting worse. SUVs have blind spots. Parking can be difficult. I've had no accidents. I didn't say you did. No tickets. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Brian's voice rose. The point is, you don't need that much car. The kitchen went silent. I looked at Rachel. She looked down. Then I looked back at my son. And who decides what I need? Brian shook his head. You're making this personal. It is my car. How much more personal could it be? We're trying to help you. That sentence did something to me. Maybe because I had heard versions of it ever since Edward died. Let me handle that, Mom. You shouldn't worry about this, Mom. I'll take care of it, Mom. At first those words had wrapped around me like blankets. Now I wondered if some of them had been ropes. I didn't ask for help replacing my car. Brian stood and paced toward the counter. You never ask for help. That's because I'm capable of doing most things myself. And I've still been here. I looked at him. What does that mean? He turned. Who fixed your disposal? I blinked. What? Who replaced the porch light? Who got someone out here when your furnace was making that noise? Who checked the roof after the storm? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You did. Exactly. Because you're my son. And because I care about you. I never said you didn't. But whenever we suggest something that might make your life easier, suddenly we're villains. Rachel spoke quietly. Brian, stop. But he didn't. I've spent 3 years making sure you're okay. A terrible sadness settled over me. I had thought those Saturdays were gifts. Apparently, Brian had been keeping receipts. So that's what this is, I asked. Payment. His face changed. No. You help your widowed mother with her furnace, so eventually you get to decide what she drives. That's ridiculous. Then stop listing favors like invoices. He looked away. Rachel pressed her lips together. I stood. The Lexus is not being traded. Brian turned back toward me. Mom, no. At least think about it. I have. You're being emotional because Dad bought it. That one hurt. I didn't let him see it. Even if I were, that's my right. Brian exhaled sharply. You're holding on to an expensive SUV because of sentiment, when that value could actually help the family. The family. Yes. I walked closer to him. Brian, I am part of the family. His expression softened slightly. I know that. Then why does helping the family always seem to mean taking something from me? He had no immediate answer. Rachel stood and picked up her purse. We should go. Brian remained where he was. I said, bring the Lexus back tomorrow. Rachel has appointments. She can rent a car. That costs money. So does owning mine. He stared at me. Something passed across his face. Not anger exactly. Disbelief. As though he had never seriously considered that I might simply refuse. Fine, he said. But his tone told me nothing was fine. At the door, Rachel turned. We really weren't trying to hurt you, Alice. I believe you. She seemed relieved. Then I added, that's what worries me. She frowned. If you can make decisions about my property without even believing you're doing something wrong, then we have a bigger problem than a car. Neither of them answered. After they left, I stood alone in the hallway. The house was quiet again. I thought about Brian's words. The furnace, the roof, the garbage disposal, the favors. Then I thought about the dealership paper. He had evaluated something I owned because he believed someone else could use its value better. For the first time, I wondered how far that thinking extended. My Lexus. My house. My savings. The commercial investments Edward had handled. What else had Brian quietly begun thinking of as something that would eventually belong to him? I went into Edward's study and sat behind his desk. The spare Lexus key was still in my pocket. I placed it on the wood. Then I remembered the trunk. Edward kneeling beside it, his hands lifting that hidden panel, his voice telling me there were important papers underneath. I had spent 3 years believing my son's increasing involvement in my life was simply love. Maybe some of it was. But love should not require the surrender of ownership. And for the first time since Edward died, I found myself wondering whether my husband had seen this coming, long before I did. What Edward told me never to forget. After Brian and Rachel left, I stayed in Edward's study until the light outside the window faded from gold to gray. The spare Lexus key lay on the desk in front of me. I kept staring at it. Not because of the car anymore, because of the memory it had unlocked. There are things grief buries without asking permission. For 3 years, I had remembered Edward's final months, mostly through hospital rooms, pill bottles, appointment calendars, and nights when I woke just to make sure he was still breathing beside me. But now another memory was returning. It had happened about 6 months before he died. Edward was still strong enough to walk around the house then, although he tired easily. He had lost weight and his clothes hung differently from his shoulders. One afternoon, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with several folders spread in front of him. What are you doing, making sure you don't have to become me after I'm gone? I frowned. What does that mean? It means you shouldn't have to spend your life figuring out where I put everything. I hated when he spoke about dying so plainly. Edward, Alice. That tone meant he wasn't going to let me change the subject. He had been organizing insurance policies, investment statements, property records, passwords, and business documents. I remember feeling irritated. Not because he was doing anything wrong, because every labeled folder made his death feel more real. Richard has the important legal documents, he said. But I want you to understand what we own and what we don't. I know what we own. He gave me a look. You know what you think we own. I threw a dish towel at him. He laughed. Then his expression became serious. There are things involving Brian you need to understand too. That was the first moment I became defensive. What about Brian? Edward leaned back. He's a good son. You sound like you're about to explain why he isn't. No. I'm explaining why being a good son doesn't make someone incapable of making bad decisions. I remember crossing my arms. What happened? Nothing happened. Then why are we discussing him? Edward was quiet for a moment. Because I've been thinking about what happens after I'm gone. I sat across from him. Stop saying that. I can't stop something by refusing to name it. My eyes filled immediately. Edward reached across the table and covered my hand. Listen to me. I did. You love Brian by giving. So do you. Yes. Then what's the problem? The problem is that sometimes Brian remembers the giving and forgets the conditions. I didn't understand, Edward explained. Years earlier, when Brian first started his renovation company, he had struggled. Edward helped him buy equipment. Later, when Brian wanted a larger workspace, Edward helped arrange favorable terms. Whenever Brian hit trouble, we were there. I had always been proud of that. Parents helped their children. That was what family did. But Edward had noticed something I hadn't. At first, he's grateful, Edward said. Very grateful. He is. At first. I frowned. Edward continued. Then enough time passes and the help becomes part of the landscape. He stops remembering that someone chose to give it. That sounds harsh. Does it? Yes. Edward nodded. Maybe it is, but harsh and false aren't the same thing. I pulled my hand away. Brian loves us. I know. He would never take advantage of us. Edward looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I remembered perfectly now. Taking advantage of someone doesn't always begin with deciding to hurt them. I said nothing. Sometimes it begins with deciding you need something more than they do. The words made my chest tighten now. 3 years later, Brian had stood in my kitchen and said almost exactly that. Rachel needs your car more than you do. I leaned back in Edward's chair and closed my eyes. The memory continued. That afternoon, Edward had told me about several times Brian had spoken casually about the future, the house, some investments, the commercial building connected to his business. Nothing overtly threatening, just phrases. When all this is mine someday. When you two aren't using it anymore. When we eventually consolidate everything. Edward noticed those words. I didn't. He's talking about inheritance, I had said. People do that. People shouldn't build plans around their parents dying. I became angry then. That's unfair. Edward didn't argue. Instead, he gathered the folders. Maybe. He stood slowly. Then he looked at me. Come outside. Why? There's something I want to show you. We walked into the garage. The Lexus was only a few years old then. Edward opened the trunk. He removed the cargo mat and lifted the ordinary storage panel. Then he reached farther toward the rear edge. His fingers found something I couldn't see. A narrow section released. I remember laughing. What did you do? Improved German-Japanese engineering. Edward, this car was expensive enough without you taking tools to it. I didn't hurt your precious Lexus. He lifted a shallow hidden panel. Beneath it was a compartment. Inside sat a dark fire-resistant document box. What is that, copies? Copies of what things I don't want disappearing. I stared at him. Why would anything disappear? Things get misplaced. Offices close. People forget conversations. You sound paranoid. Accountants call it documentation. You're not an accountant. Married one, though. I smiled despite myself. Then he became serious again. There are papers involving Brian in here. My smile disappeared. What papers? Nothing you need to worry about today. Then why hide them? I'm not hiding them from you. From Brian. Edward paused. I'm protecting them for you. I remember feeling uncomfortable. Edward, you're making our son sound dangerous. No. He lowered the panel. I'm saying grief makes people vulnerable. I looked at him. When I'm gone, Brian is going to want to help you. He will. And you'll let him. Probably. Let him fix the gutters. Let him change light bulbs. Let him bring you dinner. I laughed softly. What am I not supposed to let him do? Edward closed the trunk. Don't let him become the person who decides what you need. The garage suddenly felt very quiet. He rested one hand on the Lexus. Helping our son and surrendering our lives to him are not the same thing. I remembered rolling my eyes. You worry too much. I worry professionally. You manage commercial property. Exactly. People are much easier than plumbing. I kissed his cheek. The conversation ended. Life moved forward. Then his condition worsened. Doctors, medication, hospital visits, a walker. Hospice discussions we both pretended weren't hospice discussions. By the time Edward died, the hidden compartment in the Lexus had vanished beneath a mountain of more painful memories. Until now. I opened my eyes. The study was dark. I reached for the lamp. Edward's desk appeared beneath the warm light, and the spare key still rested exactly where I had placed it. His words echoed in my mind. Don't let him become the person who decides what you need. I had done exactly that. Not all at once. That was the frightening part. Brian hadn't marched into my life and demanded control. He had arrived carrying tools. He fixed things. He drove me places. He said, let me handle it. And because I was grieving, I had confused being cared for with being managed. Maybe Brian had confused them too. That thought mattered. I wasn't ready to make my son into a villain. I knew the man beneath the behavior. I remembered holding him as a baby, teaching him to drive, watching Edward straighten Brian's tie on his wedding day. Love did not disappear because someone disappointed you, but love also didn't change facts. Brian had kept my car. He had allowed Rachel to empty my belongings from it. He had taken it to a dealership for an appraisal without my permission. Then he had proposed using its value for his wife. Edward had warned me about exactly this kind of reasoning. Sometimes it begins with deciding you need something more than they do. I looked toward the hallway. Suddenly another thought hit me. The box was still inside the Lexus, and the Lexus was still at Brian's house. If Brian truly intended to trade the vehicle, that box could disappear with it. My pulse quickened. I picked up the spare key. I almost called Brian immediately and demanded he return the car. Then I stopped. If he knew I was coming for something hidden inside it, he might start asking questions I couldn't answer yet. I didn't know what those documents were. I didn't know why Edward had considered them important enough to hide. And I didn't know what papers involving Brian meant. I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. You okay, No? What happened? Nothing yet. I looked at Edward's empty chair across the room. But I remembered what he put in the trunk. Margaret became quiet. The compartment. Yes, and there are documents inside. What documents? I don't know. When are you going to find out? I closed my fingers around the Lexus key. Tomorrow morning. Alice, why not tonight? Because tonight I'm angry, and tomorrow I'll be careful. Margaret understood. What time? 7. I'll be there. After we hung up, I walked upstairs but didn't sleep for a long time. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about whether Brian would return my Lexus. I had made that decision for him. Tomorrow I was taking it back. It was legally mine. The title was mine. The insurance was mine. The registration was mine. I did not need my son's permission to reclaim my own property. But beneath that certainty was something much more unsettling. Edward had hidden those papers before he died. He had specifically told me they involved Brian. And years before my son ever told me that his wife needed my car more than I did, my husband had somehow understood that there might come a day when I would need proof of something. I just didn't know what. Not yet. The box under the floor. Margaret pulled into my driveway at exactly 7 the next morning. I was already outside. I had slept perhaps 3 hours, but I felt more awake than I had in weeks. The spare Lexus key was in my coat pocket along with my registration information and the photograph of the title I had taken from my files the night before. I knew I didn't need to prove ownership to my own son. Still, I wanted no uncertainty. Margaret lowered her window. Ready? Yes. You sure know? She smiled faintly. That's usually when people need to go. We drove through Richmond mostly in silence. The morning traffic was beginning to build, but Brian's neighborhood was still quiet when we arrived. The Lexus sat exactly where I had seen it before, in his driveway. For a moment I remained in Margaret's passenger seat. I could see Rachel's real estate materials through the rear window. Something about that made my hesitation disappear. "I'm taking it." Margaret nodded. "I'll follow you." I got out. The air was cool, with every step toward the Lexus. I expected Brian's front door to open. It didn't. I pressed the spare. The lights flashed. I opened the driver's door and got inside. Rachel's perfume still lingered in the cabin. I adjusted the seat. Then I took my phone out and typed a message to Brian. I kept it simple. "I have taken my Lexus home. We can discuss everything else later." I stared at the message before sending it. No apology, no request, no explanation. Send. My phone rang less than 30 seconds later. "Brian." I let it ring. Then it stopped. Immediately it rang again. I turned the phone face down. I started the Lexus. The engine came alive with the familiar quiet hum I hadn't realized I missed. For the first time in 3 weeks, I was behind my own steering wheel. I backed out. Nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no confrontation in the driveway. Just a 68-year-old woman driving away in a car that belonged to her. And somehow that felt revolutionary. Instead of going home, I followed Margaret to her house. She lived in a quiet neighborhood about 15 minutes away. Her husband had died years before Edward, and she had transformed her garage into a combination storage space and workshop. It gave us privacy. Margaret closed the garage door behind the Lexus. "All right," she said. "Show me this secret compartment." I opened the trunk. We removed Rachel's belongings first. Her brochures. The collapsible real estate sign. A tote bag. Margaret placed everything neatly in a cardboard box. "No accusations of stealing her things," she said. "Good thinking. I worked in banking for 37 years. Documentation and unnecessary caution are my love languages." Despite everything, I laughed. Then we faced the trunk. I lifted the ordinary cargo floor. There was the standard storage area beneath it. For a moment, nothing looked unusual. My heart sank. Maybe I remembered wrong. Margaret leaned closer. "You said Edward modified something." "I think so." "Then think like Edward." "That sounds exhausting." She smiled. "What did he do?" I closed my eyes. I could almost see him, his hand near the back edge, not pulling upward, pressing. I ran my fingers along the trim. Nothing. Then my thumb found a small indentation beneath the carpeted lip. I pressed it. A narrow section released with a soft click. Margaret and I looked at each other. "There," I whispered. I lifted the panel. Beneath it was a shallow compartment, and inside sat the box. Dark gray, rectangular, fire-resistant. Exactly as I remembered it. For a few seconds, neither of us touched it. Seeing something from a memory become physical again is a strange feeling. Edward had placed that box there with his own hands. 3 years after his death, I was reaching for it. I lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected. Margaret cleared a workbench. We placed the box on top. There was a small combination lock built into the front. "Oh, wonderful," I muttered. "You don't know the code. If I did, I forgot it." What numbers mattered to Edward? Everything had a number to that man. I tried his birthday. Nothing. I tried Brian's birthday. Nothing. I tried my own. Still locked. Margaret leaned against the workbench. "Anniversary." I looked at her. Of course. Edward never forgot our anniversary. Not after the vacuum cleaner incident. I entered the month and day. Click. The lock released. I covered my mouth. Margaret didn't say anything. I opened the lid. The smell hit me first. Paper. Old folders. That faint dry scent of documents stored untouched for years. Everything inside was arranged with Edward's obsessive neatness. There were several envelopes, insurance documents, copies of property records, a folder concerning one of our investment accounts. Then I saw Brian's name, Tucker Bryan, typed neatly on a tab. My stomach tightened. Beside it was another folder with an address I recognized but couldn't immediately place. And underneath both was a sealed envelope. For Alice. Edward's handwriting. I touched the words. Suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. Margaret placed her hand on my shoulder. You don't have to do this all at once. Yes, I do. No, you don't. I looked at her. I've spent 3 years not knowing what my husband thought I needed to know. I picked up the envelope. Then I put it down again. Not yet. Something told me the letter should come last. I reached for Brian's folder. There was handwriting across the front. Not typed. Edward's handwriting again. 5 words. For Alice if Brian ever forgets. A chill moved through me. Forget what Margaret whispered. I don't know. I opened the folder. The first document looked formal. Several pages. Legal language. Signatures. At the top were the words, promissory note. I stared at them. Borrower Brian Tucker. Lenders Edward Tucker and Alice Tucker. Then I saw the principal amount. $85,000. I read it twice. Then a third time. Margaret moved beside me. What is it I don't understand? She read over my shoulder. Her expression became serious. You loaned Brian $85,000. We helped him with the business. That wasn't my question. I kept reading. There was an interest rate, a payment schedule, a maturity provision. Everything looked legitimate. Then I reached the final page. Brian's signature. I recognized it immediately. Below it was Edward's, and mine. For several seconds I stared at my own signature. Then the memory returned. 8 years earlier. Brian's renovation company had nearly collapsed after a major project went wrong. There had been lawyers, unpaid invoices, equipment bills. Edward had told me Brian needed help. We had agreed to provide money. I remembered sitting at our dining table signing documents. But Edward handled the details. I had been told the money would be structured properly. After that, I rarely thought about it. Brian recovered. The company survived. Years passed. Somewhere along the way, whenever the money came up, Brian referred to it as the investment Mom and Dad made in my business. I had started using the same word, investment. But the paper in my hands did not say investment. It said loan. Margaret began sorting through the remaining pages. Here. She handed me a payment record. There were deposits, monthly payments at first, regular, then less regular, then gaps. The final recorded payment was dated shortly before Edward's health deteriorated. After that, nothing. I felt cold. Maybe Edward forgave it. Maybe Margaret said carefully, maybe there's another document. Maybe. But her voice told me not to build conclusions from hope. My phone vibrated on the workbench. Brian again. This time there was a text. Mom, what is going on? Rachel needs the car today. Call me. I stared at those words. Rachel needs the car. Not are you okay? Not why did you take it? Rachel needs it. Margaret saw the message. She said nothing. She didn't have to. I turned the phone face down. Then I looked back into the box. The folder with the unfamiliar address was still there. The envelope from Edward was still waiting. And suddenly the $85,000 promissory note felt less like the answer to a mystery than the beginning of one. I picked up the folder again. My husband's handwriting stared back at me. For Alice if Brian ever forgets. Brian had apparently forgotten that my car belonged to me. Had he forgotten something much larger too? I looked at the payment record. Then at his signature. The last payment had been made years ago. And for the first time I understood why Edward had not simply kept these papers in an ordinary filing cabinet. Whatever my husband had feared, he had wanted proof somewhere Brian could not easily reach. Somewhere attached to me. My Lexus. The very car my son had decided his wife needed. I had thought I was reclaiming a vehicle that morning. Instead, I had opened a box containing an $85,000 question my son had apparently stopped asking himself. And we weren't even halfway through what Edward had left inside. The debt. My son stopped calling a debt. I read the promissory note 3 times. Not because the language was difficult. I had spent nearly 30 years working with invoices, payroll records, vendor contracts, and financial statements. I understood exactly what I was looking at. I read it 3 times because I didn't want to understand. Borrower Brian Tucker. Original principal $85,000. Lenders Edward Tucker and Alice Tucker. The signatures were unmistakable, including mine. Margaret stood beside me at the workbench. You remember signing this? Now I do. The memory came slowly. 8 years earlier, Brian's company had been growing too fast. At least that was how Edward described it at first. Brian had taken on a major renovation project involving several upscale townhouses. He hired additional workers, purchased equipment, and committed money to materials before receiving enough payments from the developer. Then the project went bad. There were disputes over change orders. Payments were delayed. A subcontractor threatened legal action. Suddenly, Brian had payroll due and not enough cash to cover it. I remembered him sitting at our dining room table. He was 34 then. He looked exhausted. I can fix this, he kept saying. Edward listened without interrupting. How much? Brian hesitated. Dad. How much? About 75. Edward's eyebrows rose. 1,000. Brian nodded. The final amount became 85,000 after Edward reviewed everything. I had been frightened. That was a lot of money to us. We were comfortable, but we weren't wealthy people who could lose $85,000 and shrug. Brian promised he would repay every cent. I remembered that now. The exact words. Mom, I swear I'm not asking you to give me this. Edward had insisted on formal paperwork. At the time, Brian seemed almost offended. You don't trust me, Edward answered calmly. Trust is why I'm willing to lend you $85,000. Paperwork is how we make sure nobody remembers the agreement differently 10 years from now. That sentence felt almost prophetic now. I sat down on a stool in Margaret's garage. I remember. Margaret waited. He said he'd repay us. And did he? I looked at the payment record. For the first 18 months, Brian had paid consistently. Then the amounts became irregular. A payment was late. Another was smaller than required. Then 2 months were missing. Payments resumed, then stopped again. I recognized the timing. Edward had become sick. Our lives had changed almost overnight. Specialists, scans, procedures, insurance calls, medication schedules. By the time I noticed anything beyond my husband's illness, money seemed unimportant. Brian was around often. He drove Edward to appointments when I couldn't. He brought meals. He sat beside his father during treatments. I never thought to ask whether he was still paying the loan. Why would I? Edward handled it, or I assumed he did. I found the final payment on the ledger. It had been made a little over 3 years before Edward died. After that, nothing. How much is outstanding? I asked. Margaret examined the records. I wouldn't calculate anything legally from these copies alone. Richard should review the payments, interest, everything. Roughly. She hesitated. A lot. I stared at Brian's signature. A strange sadness settled over me. This wasn't about wanting the money. If Brian had come to me after Edward died and said, Mom, I can't keep making these payments, I probably would have worked something out. Maybe I would have reduced them. Maybe I would even have forgiven part of the debt. But he hadn't asked. He had simply stopped talking about it. Worse, the story itself had changed. Over the years, I had heard Brian describe the money differently. Once at Thanksgiving, Rachel had mentioned how difficult the early years of the business had been. Brian laughed and said, Thankfully, Mom and Dad invested in me. Invested. Another time he told someone Edward had put some money into the company. At some point, loan had disappeared. Investment replaced it. And because I trusted my son, I had allowed the new word to stand. Do you think Rachel knows? I asked. About the loan, yes. Margaret considered it. Do you know? Then don't assume. That was why I trusted her. She never allowed anger to do the thinking. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Brian. Mom, this is getting ridiculous. Rachel had to cancel an appointment. Please call me, I almost replied. Then another message appeared. We need to figure out the car situation like adults. I laughed once. Margaret looked at me. What I handed her the phone. She read it. Interesting choice of words. I took my own car, and apparently I'm the one behaving like a child. Don't answer while you're angry. I wasn't planning to. I placed the phone aside. Then I returned to the documents. There were copies of bank transfers matching many of Brian's payments. Edward had documented everything. Of course he had. I could practically hear him. People forget conversations. I touched one of the pages. He knew. Knew what that Brian might someday remember this differently. Margaret didn't answer. There was something painful about admitting your husband had understood your child more clearly than you had. I had defended Brian that afternoon years ago. I had told Edward he was being too suspicious. But Edward hadn't hidden these papers because he hated his son. He had lent Brian $85,000. People don't usually hand that kind of money to someone they expect to betray them. Edward trusted Brian. He simply didn't trust memory when money and family became tangled together. That was different. And wiser. I placed the loan documents back into their folder. Then my eyes moved to the second folder. The address on the tab bothered me. I knew it. I picked it up. Margaret leaned over. What is that one I don't know? I read the address aloud. 2147 Westbrook Industrial Drive. Then recognition hit me. I looked at Margaret. Oh my God. What, that's Brian's building. The company, yes. Brian's renovation business operated from a brick commercial property on Westbrook Industrial Drive. I had been there dozens of times. The front contained offices and a small showroom. Behind it were storage bays and workshop space. Brian had moved there years earlier after his company recovered from the crisis. He was proud of that building. I remembered the first Christmas party he hosted there. He had stood in the warehouse with a drink in his hand and told everyone, "This place changed everything for us." I opened the folder. The first pages contained LLC documents, operating agreements, property records, contribution schedules. Edward's name appeared repeatedly. Then mine. I frowned. Why am I on this? Margaret took one page. She read silently. Her expression sharpened. Alice. What, I think you need Richard to look at this. Why? She turned the page toward me. There was a percentage beside my name. 40%. I stared at it. That can't be right. Maybe it is. No. That's Brian's building. Is it? The question hung between us. I searched through the papers faster now. There were references to an LLC Edward had established with Brian, capital contributions, ownership interests, transfer provisions. I understood enough to know that this was not simply a lease agreement. My hands began trembling. I remembered conversations with Brian over the years. Comments I had barely noticed. When Dad's share eventually comes to me, once the building is fully mine, someday we'll borrow against the whole property and expand. I had assumed Edward had arranged everything before his death. Maybe Brian had assumed the same. Or maybe he hadn't. I looked at Margaret. Edward never told me I owned 40% of Brian's building. Maybe he did. I would remember. She gave me a gentle look. Alice, your husband was dying. There are probably a lot of things you couldn't hold on to then. That hurt because it was true. I looked back into the box. The sealed letter addressed to me remained untouched. For Alice. I wanted to open it. I almost did. But something stopped me. First, I needed facts. The loan was a fact. Brian's signature was a fact. The stopped payments were facts. The building documents might be something else entirely, and I refused to confront my son based on something I only half understood. I closed the folder. Richard. Margaret nodded. Richard. I would call Edward's attorney. I would find out exactly what these documents meant. And until then, Brian would know nothing about the box. I packed everything carefully. The promissory note, payment records, property documents, Edward's unopened letter. Then I locked the box. As I carried it toward the Lexus, I looked at the silver vehicle differently. 3 weeks earlier, Brian had treated it as an underused asset. Something that could be converted into value for someone who supposedly needed it more. But hidden beneath its trunk had been evidence of a debt he no longer called a debt. And perhaps evidence that the building he spoke about as his future security wasn't entirely his either. I had gone looking for the truth about an $85,000 loan. Instead, I had found my name attached to the foundation of my son's business. And I was beginning to understand that the most valuable thing Brian had tried to take from me was never the Lexus. It was my right to know what still belonged to me. The building he thought was his safety net. I called Richard Hayes from Margaret's kitchen before I drove home. He answered on the fourth ring. Alice Tucker, he said warmly. It's been a while. Richard had been Edward's attorney for nearly 20 years. He had handled property purchases, business agreements, and the endless paperwork Edward considered more interesting than normal human conversation. I found some documents Edward left behind. Richard became quieter. What kind of documents? A promissory note involving Brian. And papers for Westbrook Industrial Drive. There was a pause, not confusion, recognition. Where did you find them? In a box Edward left for me. Another pause. Are you free tomorrow morning? That question told me enough to know the papers mattered. Yes, bring everything. The next morning I drove my Lexus to Richard's office myself. That detail mattered to me. For 3 weeks, other people had decided where my car should be. Now the document box sat on the passenger seat and I chose the destination. Richard's office occupied the second floor of a brick building near downtown Richmond. It hadn't changed much since Edward and I last visited together. Richard greeted me at reception. He was 61 now, with more gray hair than I remembered. When he saw the box, his expression changed. Well, he said quietly, Edward really did keep copies. You knew about this. I knew he kept backup records somewhere. In my car. Richard blinked. Your car under the trunk floor. He laughed once. That sounds like Edward. We went into his office. I placed the documents on his desk. Richard started with the promissory note. He read it carefully, checked several pages, and examined the payment record. Is this still valid? I asked. The underlying obligation didn't magically become a gift because payments stopped. I swallowed. Edward never forgave it, not through any document I prepared. Could he have done it another way? Possibly. But if you're asking whether I have a debt forgiveness agreement in my records, the answer is no. I looked down. I don't want Brian ruined over this. Richard removed his glasses. Nobody said anything about ruining Brian. I need to understand what I have before I decide what to do. That's exactly what you should be doing. Then I handed him the Westbrook folder. His reaction was immediate. He leaned back. This is what you really wanted to ask me about. I don't even know what I'm asking. He opened the operating agreement. For the next 15 minutes, Richard read while I sat in silence. Finally, he turned the folder toward me. Westbrook Industrial Drive is owned through Westbrook Property Holdings, LLC. I gathered that much. Originally, Edward and Brian both held membership interests. And now Richard tapped a section. Edward structured part of his interests so that your ownership rights survived according to the estate and operating documents. Based on what I'm seeing here and what I remember preparing, you currently hold 40%. I stared at him. 40% of Brian's building. Richard corrected me gently. 40% of the LLC that owns the building. That's different. Legally, yes. Practically, for this conversation, the important point is that Brian does not own 100%. I leaned back. I remembered standing in that building during Brian's Christmas parties. I remembered watching him install new office flooring. I remembered Rachel talking about what they might do once the property was fully theirs. How could I not know? Richard's face softened. Alice, you were dealing with Edward's illness. But I signed estate documents. You did. Did you explain this? Yes. The answer hurt. Richard continued gently. You were sitting right there with Edward. You asked questions. You understood it that day. I looked toward the window. And then I forgot. You had a husband dying. That's not the same as carelessness. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that frightened me. Does Brian know? Richard hesitated. He should. That's not what I asked. I wasn't present for every conversation Edward had with him. Did Brian sign anything? Richard searched through the documents. Yes. He found a page. Brian's signature appeared beneath provisions relating to ownership interests. I felt my stomach drop. So he knows. He knew when he signed this. That distinction mattered. Maybe Brian had forgotten details. Maybe he had convinced himself circumstances had changed. But he could not honestly claim the arrangement had never existed. I remembered something he had said at a family dinner 2 years earlier. We had been talking about expanding his business. Brian mentioned adding another warehouse. Rachel asked whether that would require a loan. Brian said, "Eventually, when the Westbrook property is completely mine, we'll have plenty of equity to work with." At the time, I had smiled. Completely mine. Eventually. Those words sounded different now. I told Richard. His expression remained neutral. Did Edward ever promise his share to Brian not through any binding document I prepared? Could Brian inherit my 40%? That's your decision. I looked at him. My decision. Alice, you're alive. The simplicity of the statement almost made me laugh. Richard continued. Your estate plan determines what happens to your assets after your death, subject to whatever governing agreements apply. But Brian cannot treat a future inheritance as present ownership. There it was again. The same problem as the Lexus. Something might belong to Brian someday. Therefore, in his mind, perhaps it already partly did. I felt cold. Could he sell the building? Not by himself, in a way that ignores your interest and the operating agreement. Could he borrow against it? Not the entire property, as though he were sole owner. Any financing would have to comply with the LLC documents and lender requirements. What if he tried? Richard's expression sharpened. Has he? I don't know. He leaned forward. Then don't accuse him of anything you cannot establish. I won't. But you should make sure your records are current. What do I need to do? We'll review the LLC's present filings, confirm ownership records, and make sure notices are going where they should. I nodded. Then Richard asked, why are you looking at all this now? I told him about the Lexus, the 3-day loan, 3 weeks, the dealership appraisal, the proposal to trade my car for a smaller vehicle and use the remaining value toward Rachel's replacement. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he removed his glasses again. Did you authorize any trade, sign anything? No. Then don't. I wasn't planning to. Good. I looked at the Westbrook documents. Do you think Edward expected this? Richard considered his answer carefully. Edward worried about dependency. Brian depending on us both directions. I frowned. He worried that after he died you'd become dependent on Brian emotionally. And he worried Brian might become dependent on the assumption that eventually your assets would solve his problems. That sentence landed hard. I thought about my son, his company, his confidence, his constant talk about expansion, the Lexus, the building, the $85,000 loan that had quietly stopped being called a loan. How much of Brian's future does he think belongs to me first? I whispered. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he asked something worse. Has Brian been making financial decisions based on the assumption that this building will eventually be his? I looked up. I don't know. But memories were already moving through my mind. Brian talking about adding crews. Brian mentioning new equipment. Brian saying Westbrook would one day give him room to leverage. Rachel talking about retirement, plans, growth, equity, all built around the word someday. My phone vibrated inside my purse. Brian. I didn't answer. A text followed. Mom, Rachel and I want to come over tonight. We found a solution that works for everyone. I stared at it. Richard noticed my expression. Problem. My son has apparently found another solution for me. I showed him the message. Richard handed the phone back. Then remember something before he arrives. What a solution involving your property requires your consent. I packed the documents. Before leaving, I placed my hand on the Westbrook folder. Richard, I don't want to punish my son. Then don't. But I don't want to be treated like I'm already gone. His expression softened. Those are not the same thing. I carried the box downstairs. Outside, the Lexus waited exactly where I had parked it. Mine. For now, that word felt more important than ever. I put the box in the passenger seat rather than the trunk. As I drove home, I kept thinking about Brian's message. A solution that works for everyone. I had heard that language before. Practical, efficient, family, words that somehow always ended with me surrendering something. But Brian still didn't know what I had found beneath the trunk floor. He didn't know I had spoken to Richard. And he certainly didn't know that the building he talked about as his future safety net was still 40% mine. I had spent weeks wondering why my son wouldn't return my car. Now I was beginning to wonder something far more troubling. Maybe Brian didn't think he was taking anything from me at all. Maybe in his mind, he was simply using early what he already believed would one day be his. The letter from my husband. When I got home from Richard's office, I carried Edward's box into the kitchen and locked the back door behind me. I don't know why I locked it. Brian had a key to my house. That thought stopped me. For years, his having a key had felt reassuring. That afternoon, it felt different. I went to the drawer where we kept spare keys and found the extra deadbolt key Edward had labeled years earlier. Then I locked the door properly. Not because I believed Brian would walk in and steal documents. I wasn't ready to think that badly of my son. I simply needed 1 hour in which nobody could enter my home without my permission. I placed the box on the kitchen table. The unopened envelope lay on top. For Alice. I had postponed reading it because I wanted facts first. Now I had them. The $85,000 had been a loan. Brian had stopped paying it. I still held 40% of the LLC that owned the Westbrook property, and Brian had no legal right to treat that ownership as his, simply because he expected to inherit something someday. There was nothing left to investigate before opening Edward's letter. Still my hands shook. I slid my finger beneath the flap. Inside were 4 handwritten pages. Edward's handwriting became less steady near the end of his illness, but this letter had been written earlier. The letters were firm and familiar. Alice. If you're reading this, I'm hoping it's because you're finally cleaning out that car the way I've asked you to for years. I laughed. Then I started crying. Only Edward could make me laugh in the first sentence of a letter from the grave. I wiped my eyes and continued. I explained that the box contained copies, not necessarily every original. Richard had handled the legal records, but Edward wanted another set somewhere under my control. Then he explained why. The Lexus. He had chosen it because the title was in my name. The insurance was mine. It was something intended specifically for me. He believed it was the one substantial asset in our lives Brian would have no practical reason to manage. I stopped reading. The irony was almost cruel. Of all the places Edward could have chosen, he had hidden the documents inside the very thing Brian had eventually decided I no longer needed. I continued. Edward wrote about Brian with love. That surprised me even though it shouldn't have. There was no bitterness in the letter. He wrote about teaching Brian to ride a bicycle, taking him fishing, helping him start his first business, standing beside him on his wedding day. Then the tone changed. Brian is a good man, Alice. But good people can become dangerous to the people they love when they start believing their intentions give them authority. I read that sentence twice. Edward wrote that he had watched something change in our son over the years. Whenever Brian needed help, he began with gratitude. Later, he remembered the help differently. A loan became support. Support became investment. Access became expectation. Expectation became entitlement. Edward did not accuse Brian of being dishonest. That distinction mattered. He believed Brian often convinced himself that his version of events was fair. That frightened Edward more than deliberate greed would have. A greedy man knows he is taking something he wrote. A man who believes he deserves it can call the taking love. I put the letter down. My kitchen blurred through my tears. Rachel needs your car more than you do. There it was. Not the exact sentence, the same thinking. I picked up the letter again. Edward explained the $85,000. He had never intended to punish Brian over the debt. If the company failed despite Brian's best efforts, Edward had been willing to restructure it. If Brian came honestly and said he couldn't pay, Edward would listen. What mattered was acknowledgement, responsibility, the understanding that generosity did not rewrite an agreement. Then Edward wrote about Westbrook. He had deliberately structured the property so I would retain meaningful ownership after his death. Not because he wanted me involved in Brian's daily business. He wanted me protected. The property generated value. My share represented security. Brian might eventually inherit some or all of it, but eventually was the important word. Edward underlined it. Then I reached the paragraph that broke me. What we leave our son after we are gone must never become permission for him to take from you while you are still here. I pressed the paper against my chest. For 3 years I had missed Edward so much that sometimes I spoke to him while making coffee. I told him when the roof leaked. I told him when Brian came over. I told him when the neighbor's dog dug up my flowers. But sitting at that table I felt as though Edward had answered me. Not with instructions, with permission. Permission to remain alive in my own life. I kept reading. He warned me not to use the documents as weapons. If Brian disappoints you, don't punish him because you're angry at me for dying. Don't make him pay for leaving you alone when I was the one who left first. I covered my mouth. That was Edward. Even in death he knew where my anger might hide. The next line was simpler. Protect yourself. Don't revenge me. I whispered I won't. The final page contained no financial details. Just Edward talking to his wife. He told me to travel if I wanted, spend money without apologizing, keep friends who made me laugh, replace the kitchen counters even though he thought the old ones were perfectly good, and drive. That word made me smile. Drive wherever you want, Alice. You've spent enough years asking everyone else where they need to go. I couldn't read the final sentence for several minutes. When I finally did, it was only 5 words. Your life is still yours. I sat there crying until the tears stopped on their own. Then I folded the letter carefully. Something had changed. Before reading it, I had been collecting evidence against Brian. After reading it, I realized that was the wrong way to think. I didn't need evidence against my son. I needed evidence for myself, for my right to say no, for my right to own something without explaining why I deserved it, for my right to decide what happened to property I had worked for. Brian did not have to be evil for me to have boundaries. Rachel did not have to be malicious. I didn't have to prove either of them intended to hurt me. Intent wasn't ownership. Love wasn't permission. I placed the letter back in its envelope. Then I heard a car door outside. I looked toward the front window. Brian's truck had pulled into my driveway. Rachel was in the passenger seat. I glanced at the clock. I had forgotten his message about coming over. They both got out. Brian walked around to the passenger side and opened the rear door. He removed a dark folder. Rachel carried what looked like a dealership brochure. My stomach tightened. I looked at Edward's letter, then at the document spread across my kitchen table. I gathered everything quickly and returned it to the fire-resistant box. The box was too large to hide casually, so I carried it into Edward's study and placed it beneath the desk. The doorbell rang. Once. Then again. I stood in the hallway. For the first time since Edward died, I didn't feel frightened by the idea of disappointing my son. I felt sad. There was a difference. Brian had spent years believing that helping me gave him a larger voice in my decisions. I had spent years allowing it because saying no felt ungrateful. Edward's letter had stripped away that confusion. The bell rang a third time. I walked toward the door. Before opening it, I looked through the narrow window. Brian held the folder against his chest. Rachel held the dealership brochure. They were smiling, not cruelly, hopefully. That almost made it worse. They genuinely believed they had solved my problem. A problem I had never asked them to solve. I opened the door. "Hi, Mom," Brian said. Rachel smiled. "We found something we think you're going to love." I looked at the folder. "What is it?" Brian stepped inside. "Remember the smaller crossover we talked about?" My heart sank. Hun hadn't heard me at all. Not really. I had told him no, and he had translated it into not yet. Behind me, inside Edward's study, sat the promissory note, the Westbrook documents, and a letter warning me about this exact moment. Brian smiled and opened the folder. "We did some numbers. This works for everybody." There it was again. Everybody. I stepped aside and let them enter. But as Brian walked past me, carrying paperwork for a decision he still believed he could make on my behalf, Edward's final words stayed in my mind. "Your life is still yours." This time, I intended to act like it. My son brought sales papers to my house. Brian walked into my kitchen as though the argument we'd had 2 days earlier had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Rachel followed him, carrying the glossy dealership brochure. She placed it on the table and opened it to a photograph of a compact crossover. "Isn't this beautiful?" I looked at the picture, then at her. What is it, a Lexus UX, she said. Smaller than your RX, easier to park, great safety features. We thought you'd like staying with Lexus. We thought. Brian placed his folder beside the brochure. I ran the numbers. I didn't ask you to run any numbers. His smile weakened. I know, Mom. Just hear us out. I already heard you out. This is different. How? Because now we know exactly what the deal would look like. He opened the folder. There were printed estimates, financing information, a trade-in worksheet, and something that appeared to be a preliminary purchase agreement. I stared at the papers. They had gone farther than I realized. How did you get this? Brian sat down. I spoke with the dealership. You went back. We never really stopped talking to them. Rachel quickly added, Nothing is final. I turned toward her. Did you put money down? She hesitated. Brian answered, A small refundable deposit. I stared at him. On a car for me. Technically, it's just holding the vehicle. A vehicle I never agreed to buy. You don't have to buy it? Then why are we holding it? Brian rubbed his forehead. Mom, please. You're getting caught up in the process instead of looking at the result. That sentence almost made me smile. For 30 years, I had been paid to pay attention to process. Process was where people hid things. Process was where assumptions became signatures. I sat across from him. Explain the result. Brian seemed relieved. He pushed one of the pages toward me. Your RX has excellent resale value. Better than we expected. I know. He looked surprised. I let him wonder how. He continued. If we trade it now, you can get the smaller crossover with newer safety technology. Your monthly costs would be lower, and you'd still have something nice. I don't have monthly payments now. I mean fuel insurance maintenance. Go on. He glanced at Rachel. The remaining trade equity would help us replace Rachel's SUV. There it was. Exactly what he had proposed before. Only now it came with paperwork. So I lose the car Edward bought me, and Rachel gets help buying hers. You don't lose a car. Brian tapped the brochure. You get this. I don't want this. You haven't driven it. I don't need to drive it. Rachel leaned forward. Alice, we aren't trying to push you. I looked at the paperwork. You placed a deposit. She went quiet. Brian said, Because the dealership only had one in the color we thought you'd like. You thought I'd like? Yes. You thought. He sighed. Mom. No, Brian. That's the problem. You keep thinking for me. His face tightened. We're trying to make life easier. Who's everybody's? I leaned back. Then let me make this very simple. I am keeping my Lexus. Rachel looked at Brian. He stared at me. Can you at least tell me why? I almost couldn't believe the question. Because it's mine. Besides that. There doesn't need to be a besides that. His jaw tightened. This is exactly what I mean. What do you mean you won't even consider whether something makes sense? It makes sense for Rachel. It makes sense for you too. According to you. Brian stood. You're 68 years old, Mom, and you don't need a mid-size luxury SUV to drive 5 miles to church and the grocery store. There was the sentence again. The shrinking of my life. I felt Edward's letter in my mind. Your life is still yours. I drove myself to Richard Hayes's office yesterday. Brian froze. Only for a second. But I saw it. Richard? Yes. What did you need a lawyer for? I didn't say I needed a lawyer. Then why were you there? I held his gaze. I had questions. About the car, among other things. His expression changed. Suspicion entered the room. Rachel looked between us. What other things? I ignored the question. Brian sat again. Mom, if you're worried we're trying to do something without your permission, we're not. That's why we're here. You had my car appraised without permission. That wasn't a transaction. You removed my belongings from it. Rachel needed space. You kept it 3 weeks after asking for 3 days. Because her SUV died. You put a deposit on another car for me after I told you no. Brian pushed the papers away. All right. Fine. We're terrible people for trying to solve a problem. Rachel touched his arm. Brian. No, I'm tired of this. He looked at me. I've spent 3 years helping you. The old invoice again. I said nothing. He continued. I've been the one making sure this house doesn't fall apart. I've taken calls when you needed something. I've rearranged work because you had appointments, and I appreciated it. Did you? Yes, because it doesn't feel like it. My voice remained quiet. Gratitude does not transfer ownership. Brian laughed bitterly. Ownership? That's what everything is about with you now. No. Ownership became important when you stopped respecting it. He stood again. Rachel looked uncomfortable. This is getting too heated. But Brian was no longer listening to her. You're sitting in a paid-off house. You have savings, investments, a luxury vehicle you barely use. And we're trying to keep a business going and replace a car Rachel actually needs for work. I stared at him. So because I have more than you think I need, you get to decide how the extra is distributed. That's not what I'm saying. It sounds exactly like what you're saying. We're family. Yes, you're acting like we're strangers trying to steal from you. I haven't accused you of stealing. You went to Dad's lawyer. There was something in his voice now. Not merely anger. Fear. That interested me. Why does that worry you? It doesn't. You reacted strongly. Because it's ridiculous. What is dragging lawyers into family matters? I thought about the box in Edward's study. Brian had no idea how deeply lawyers were already involved in our family matters. His father had made sure of it years ago. Rachel stood. Maybe we should leave. But Brian remained where he was. He looked around my kitchen frustrated. Then he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. I just don't understand why you're making such a big deal over things that are all coming to me eventually anyway. Silence. Absolute silence. Even Brian seemed startled by his own words. Rachel's face changed. Brian. He looked at her, then back at me. That's not how I meant it. I felt no anger, not immediately. What I felt was grief, a deep, quiet grief. Because Edward had been right. Not about Brian being evil. He had never said that. He had been right about entitlement. I spoke carefully. What exactly is coming to you eventually? Brian rubbed his face. Mom, forget it. No. I said it badly. You said it honestly. That isn't fair. Then explain it. He couldn't. I stood. Brian watched me. Where are you going? To show you something. I walked through the hallway and into Edward's study. The fire-resistant box sat beneath the desk. For a moment I rested my hand on it. Edward had told me not to use these documents for revenge. I wasn't. I wasn't going to threaten Brian. I wasn't going to humiliate him. But my son had just admitted that somewhere in his mind, my possessions had already begun their journey toward becoming his. He needed to understand the difference between future possibility and present ownership. I lifted the box. It was heavier than I remembered. When I returned to the kitchen, Brian stared at it. His face lost color. Rachel looked confused. What is that? I placed the box on the table. Brian didn't take his eyes off it. Where did you get that? The question was almost a whisper. You recognize it, no. But his answer came too quickly. I sat down. This was locked beneath the floor of my Lexus. Rachel looked toward Brian. When I opened the lid, the first thing visible was Edward's handwriting. Brian's eyes fixed on it. For Alice, if Brian ever forgets. He swallowed. I removed the folder. Then I placed the promissory note on the table. Brian looked down. His face changed completely. Rachel leaned closer. What is that? Brian said nothing. I slid the document toward him. You said everything was coming to you eventually. His eyes remained on his father's signature. I continued. But before we discuss what you think you're going to inherit, I think we should talk about something you already received. Rachel picked up the first page. Her eyes moved down the document. Then she stopped at the amount. $85,000. She looked at her husband. Brian, what is this? For the first time since he'd walked into my house carrying sales papers, my son had absolutely nothing to say. I put the box on the table. Rachel kept staring at the number. $85,000. Then she looked at Brian. What is this? Brian didn't answer. The man who had spent the last half hour explaining depreciation, trade-in values, fuel efficiency, and what kind of vehicle was appropriate for a 68-year-old woman suddenly couldn't find a single word. Rachel turned the promissory note toward him. "Brian, it's old. That isn't what I asked." He rubbed both hands over his face. "It's from when the company was struggling." Rachel looked back at the document. "This says loan. I know what it says. You told me your parents invested in the company." "They did." "No," I said quietly. "We loaned you money." Brian looked at me. "Mom, don't do this." I almost laughed. "Do what?" "Turn Dad's old paperwork into some kind of courtroom. You brought paperwork into my kitchen first." His eyes flicked toward the dealership folder. He had no response to that. Rachel continued reading. Her expression grew more confused. There was a payment schedule. Brian stood. "We don't need to go through every page." "Yes," Rachel said. "We do." Something in her voice changed. Until that moment, Rachel and Brian had been standing on the same side of the disagreement. Now she was discovering there were facts her husband had never shared with her. I removed the payment history from the folder. This was in the box, too. Brian stared at me. "Mom." I slid it across the table. Rachel took it. She followed the dates with her finger. "You were making payments. For a while. Then you stopped." Brian's jaw tightened. "Dad got sick." Rachel looked up. "What does that have to do with owing money?" I talked to him. I felt my heart jump. "You talked to Edward about stopping the payments." Brian hesitated. "Yes." "What did he say?" "That we'd deal with it later." "Did he say the loan was forgiven?" Brian looked away. "Not in those words." "Then what words, Mom? It was years ago." I remained calm. "Did your father tell you that you no longer owed the money?" Silence. Rachel answered for him. "He didn't." Brian snapped. "You weren't there." "No, I wasn't," she said. "Apparently I wasn't there for a lot of things." That landed. Brian turned toward her. "Rachel, don't. You told me they put money into the company. They did. You made it sound like an investment. Because functionally, that's what it became." I heard Edward's voice in my memory. "The help becomes part of the landscape." I understood now. Brian wasn't lying in the simple way people usually lie. He had repeated his preferred version so many times that he had built a home inside it. The money saved his company. His father stopped asking about payments while he was sick. Years passed. Therefore, in Brian's mind, the debt had somehow dissolved. No formal forgiveness. No conversation with me. Just time. "Richard reviewed it," I said. Brian's head snapped toward me. "You showed this to Richard?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted to understand what I was looking at." "You could have asked me." I stared at him. "You haven't mentioned this loan since your father died." He said nothing. "So no, Brian. I wasn't going to ask you what the documents meant. I asked someone who didn't have 85,000 reasons to remember them differently." Rachel lowered her eyes. Brian looked hurt. For a moment I almost apologized. Then I remembered why we were sitting there. My car, my property, his dealership papers. Everything is coming to me eventually anyway. I reached into the box again. "There is something else." Brian saw the Westbrook folder. His expression changed before I even opened it. That was all the confirmation I needed that he recognized it. I placed the LLC documents on the table. Rachel frowned. "What are those? Westbrook Industrial Drive?" She looked at Brian. "You're building our building," he said quickly. I corrected him. "The LLC's building." Brian gave me an irritated look. "Same difference." "No. Apparently it isn't." I opened the operating agreement. Rachel leaned closer. I pointed to the ownership information Richard had explained. "According to these documents, and according to Richard, Y still hold 40% of the LLC that owns Westbrook." Rachel stared at me, then at Brian. Brian folded his arms. "Dad always intended for that interest to come to me." "Eventually," I said. His mouth closed. I continued. "Edward died. I didn't." Rachel picked up the document. She read the percentage. Then she looked at Brian again. "You told me Westbrook was basically yours." "It is." "No, Brian. 40% belongs to your mother. It's family ownership." I felt something cold move through me. There was that phrase again, family ownership. I asked, if it's family ownership, why didn't you consult this family member before talking about borrowing against it? Rachel's head turned sharply. What? Brian stared at me. I never borrowed against it. I didn't say you did. Then why would you say that? Because you've talked about using the building's equity to expand. That was hypothetical. Rachel looked increasingly unsettled. You told me once the equipment loan was gone, Westbrook would give us options. It will. How Brian became impatient. Because eventually the ownership gets consolidated. Rachel stared at him. Consolidated when he didn't answer. I did. When I die. The words fell heavily. Rachel's face changed. No. Yes. Brian pushed his chair back. That isn't what I meant. But it is what the plan requires, isn't it, Mom? You're twisting everything. I shook my head. No. For the first time, I'm untwisting it. I wasn't shouting. That seemed to disturb Brian more than anger would have. I touched the promissory note. You borrowed money. Over time, you began calling it an investment. Then the Westbrook papers. You don't own the entire building. Over time, you began talking as though you eventually will. Then I pointed toward the window where my Lexus sat in the driveway. You borrowed my car for 3 days. Over time, you started planning what vehicle should replace it and where its value should go. Brian looked at me. For once, he had no quick explanation. I continued. Do you see the pattern? He looked away. Rachel did not. I could see that in her face. She sat back slowly. Oh my God. Brian turned toward her. What? She shook her head. All this time I thought we were more secure than we were. We are secure. Are we? Yes. How much of what you've told me about our future depends on things your mother owns? Brian's expression hardened. This isn't the time. It seems like exactly the time. He lowered his voice. Rachel. No. She stood. You told me your father helped capitalize the business. He did. You didn't tell me you still owed that money. It wasn't relevant. To our finances, I was handling it. You weren't handling it. You stopped paying it. Brian looked furious now. But underneath the anger, I saw something else. Fear. Rachel saw it too. Her voice became quieter. How bad is it? Brian froze. What? What the company? Don't start. How bad is it? It's fine. She stared at him. No, it isn't. Rachel. You wanted Mom's Lexus because my SUV broke. Yes. You said buying another vehicle right now would put pressure on cash flow. That doesn't mean you've been talking about Westbrook equity for months. Brian stood. Enough. Rachel didn't move. Her eyes stayed on him. How bad is the company, Brian? He looked at me as though I had caused the question. Maybe in a way I had. Not by creating the problem. By opening the box that prevented him from hiding behind assumptions. I didn't bring this out to destroy you, I said. He laughed bitterly. Could have fooled me. Your father specifically told me not to use these documents for revenge. That stopped him. You read a letter from Dad. Yes. His face softened for half a second. What did he say? That helping you and surrendering my life to you were not the same thing. Brian looked down. I wanted to reach for him. That instinct was still there. Motherhood doesn't disappear because your child is 42 and disappointing you. But I kept my hands on the table. Rachel sat again. Brian. I didn't look at her. She asked one more time. How bad is the company? The silence lasted so long that I heard the refrigerator cycle on behind us. Finally, Brian pulled out a chair. He sat. His shoulders dropped. The anger seemed to leave him all at once. When he looked up, he no longer looked like the man who had arrived carrying a solution for everyone. He looked tired, older, afraid. And I suddenly understood that the Lexus had never really been about Rachel needing a nicer car. There was something else beneath all of it. Something Brian had been hiding from both of us. He looked at his wife, then at me, and said quietly, "Worse than I've told either of you." The real reason he needed my car. Worse how Rachel asked the question before I could. Brian stared at the table. The dealership papers were still spread beside Edward's documents, two versions of our family sitting side by side. On one side was the future Brian had tried to arrange. On the other was the past he had stopped acknowledging. He rubbed his palms against his pants. "We're short on cash." Rachel's face tightened. "How short it's complicated. Then uncomplicate it." Brian looked at her. I had never heard Rachel speak to him that way. He took a breath. "The Henderson project put us behind." I knew the name only vaguely. Brian had mentioned renovating several large homes for a developer outside Richmond. "What happened?" I asked. "Change orders, material costs, delays. Everything that could go wrong did." He explained that lumber and specialty materials had cost more than expected. One subcontractor walked off the project. Another demanded payment before finishing. Then the developer disputed part of Brian's invoice. "How much are they withholding?" Rachel asked. "About 60,000. Her mouth opened. "You told me 20. I didn't want you worrying." Rachel laughed once without humor. "So you lied to keep me calm. I was trying to fix it." The phrase again. Trying to help, trying to fix, trying to protect. All the words people use when they don't want to admit they made someone else's decision for them. Brian continued. "We also have a business loan coming due." "How much?" I asked. He hesitated. "Enough." "Brian." He looked at me. 48,000. Rachel stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. 48. "We don't have to pay all of it at once if the bank renews the note." "If they probably will." "Probably, Rachel, please." She walked toward the window. For the first time I felt sympathy for her. She had helped keep my Lexus. She had participated in deciding I didn't need it. That responsibility belonged to her. But she had also been making decisions inside a marriage where the financial foundation was not what her husband had represented. Both things could be true. I looked at Brian. "Is the company failing?" "No." The answer came quickly. Then he softened it. "Not yet." That frightened me more. He explained that he still had active projects and receivables. The company wasn't worthless. It wasn't days from closing. But cash flow was dangerously tight. If the developer paid what Brian believed he was owed, much of the pressure would ease. If the bank renewed the business note, he would gain time. If two upcoming projects started on schedule, revenue would improve. There were many ifs. Edward hated financial plans built from ifs. "So where does my Lexus fit into this?" I asked. Brian looked away. Rachel turned from the window. "Yes, I'd like to hear that too." I was silent long enough that I already knew the answer wouldn't be comfortable. When Rachel's SUV started failing, the repair estimate was almost $9,000. "I know," she said. "We didn't have $9,000 to throw at an old vehicle. You told me we could afford another one. We could finance one." "With what down payment?" He didn't answer. Rachel's face changed. "My God." Brian leaned forward. "That's why I started looking at options." I spoke quietly. "My car." "Yes." The word sounded smaller than the damage it represented. He continued quickly. "Your Lexus has strong equity. If we traded it, we could get you into something smaller without taking on much additional cost and use the structure of the deal to reduce what we'd need for Rachel. Reduce what you'd need from where the business account." There it was. The real reason. Rachel hadn't simply needed my car more than I did. Brian needed to preserve cash. My Lexus had become a financial pressure valve. "You wanted my vehicle so you wouldn't have to take money out of your company." "I wanted a solution that helped everybody." "No. You wanted a solution that cost me something instead of costing you something." His face tightened. "That's not fair, isn't it? You would still have had a vehicle you selected, a good vehicle, one I didn't want." He shook his head. "You're making it sound like I was trying to leave you stranded." "I never said that." "Then what are you saying, that you decided my property was available to solve your problem?" He went quiet. Rachel sat down again. "Why didn't you just tell me we couldn't afford another SUV?" Brian looked at her. "I didn't want you thinking we'd failed." Her expression softened for a second, then hardened again. "So you were willing to make your mother give something up instead?" "I wasn't making her give it up. You had her car appraised. I was exploring. You put a deposit down. That was refundable. You kept her Lexus for 3 weeks. His frustration returned. Because you needed transportation. Rachel flinched. Then she said something that surprised both of us. I could have rented a cheap car. Brian stared at her. I could have canceled some showings. Borrowed something. Bought an older used car. I didn't need Alice's Lexus. He looked wounded. You didn't say that 3 weeks ago. No. I liked driving it. Her honesty silenced the room. I liked how it looked when I met clients. I liked not worrying about my SUV. And when you kept saying your mother barely used it, I let myself believe that made it okay. Rachel turned to me. It didn't. I nodded. I wasn't ready to forgive everything, but truth deserved recognition. Brian stood and walked toward the kitchen counter. You both make it sound so simple. It is simple, I said. He turned. No, Mom, it isn't. I have employees. Families depend on those paychecks. I have contracts, vendors, a bank that wants numbers every month. I've spent 12 years building this company, I know, and I'm trying not to lose it. His voice cracked slightly. That was the first moment I heard fear instead of entitlement. I wake up at 3 in the morning, calculating what can wait. Which vendor can get paid Friday instead of Wednesday? Whether a client will release a check. Whether the bank will renew. I felt my anger shift. Not disappear. Shift. This was my son. Scared, ashamed, desperate. But desperation explained his behavior. It did not excuse it. Why didn't you come to me, I asked. He laughed bitterly. And say what Dad helped me once and I messed up again. Your father helping you wasn't the problem. He looked toward the promissory note. I know what you're thinking. Do you? That I'm some spoiled son waiting for his mother to die. The words hurt. I don't think you're waiting for me to die. Sure sounds like it. I think you stopped separating what might someday be yours from what belongs to me today. He stared at me. I continued. And because you were afraid that line became convenient. His eyes dropped. I touched the promissory note. You did it with this. Then the Westbrook documents. You did it with the building. Finally, I nodded toward the driveway. And you did it with my car. Brian sank into the chair. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he said quietly, I didn't think of it as taking. I know. He looked up surprised. That may be the part that hurts most. His face crumpled slightly. I thought... He stopped. What? He swallowed. I thought eventually everything Dad built would stay in the family. The building, the investments, whatever you didn't use, whatever I didn't use. I don't mean it like that. But you did. He pressed his hands together. I kept telling myself I wasn't taking something away from you. I was just using something earlier. The room went completely still. There it was. The truth. Not a criminal scheme, not a son plotting against his mother. Something more ordinary and in some ways more painful. Entitlement wrapped in desperation. Brian had mentally spent part of his inheritance while I was still alive. Rachel stared at him. Do you hear yourself? Yes. His answer was barely audible. For the first time, I believed he did. I looked at the documents. Legally, I had leverage. The loan. The ownership interest. Richard had made that clear. If I demanded everything aggressively, I could put enormous pressure on Brian at the worst possible moment. Perhaps enough to push his company over the edge. Brian seemed to realize the same thing. His eyes moved toward the promissory note. Are you going to call the loan? I haven't decided what I'm going to do. His face drained. Mom, if you demand that money now, I know. The company could collapse. I know. He looked terrified. A week earlier, part of me might have found satisfaction in seeing him understand that I had power too. Now I didn't. Power wasn't what I wanted. Respect was. Responsibility was. My life back was. I closed the folder. I'm going to speak with Richard again. Brian looked down. Rachel asked, what happens until then? The Lexus stays with me. Neither argued. The dealership deal is cancelled. Rachel nodded. And nobody makes another decision involving my property without asking me first. Brian said nothing. Did you hear me? Yes. I stood and gathered Edward's papers. Brian watched me place them back in the box. "What do I owe you?" he asked. It sounded like he meant money. I looked at my son. "I haven't decided what you owe me yet." His expression tightened. Then I added, "But it's bigger than money." I carried the box toward Edward's study. Behind me, nobody spoke. For the first time since this began, Brian finally understood that the crisis wasn't about whether his business survived. It was about whether our relationship could survive the way he had chosen to save it. I didn't destroy him. The next morning, I called Richard before I could change my mind. Not about protecting myself. That part was settled. What frightened me was deciding what protection should look like without turning it into punishment. Brian had hurt me. There was no polite way around that. But I didn't want to wake up 6 months later and discover that I had used my pain to destroy my son's livelihood simply because I had the legal power to do it. Edward's words stayed with me. "Protect yourself. Don't revenge me." Richard agreed to meet that afternoon. I brought the entire box. After I explained Brian's financial situation, Richard leaned back in his chair. "You understand that compassion and forgiveness are not the same as giving up your rights. I'm beginning to. And you don't have to decide Brian's entire future today." "I know. What do you want?" That question was harder than it sounded. Not what could I demand, not what was legally available. What did I want? I want my son to stop treating my life like an account he will eventually inherit. Richard nodded. "What else? I want him to take responsibility for the loan." "Good. I don't want the company destroyed. Also reasonable. And I want Westbrook protected." Richard folded his hands. "Then we can build around those goals." We spent almost 2 hours reviewing options. The $85,000 loan had not vanished, but Richard advised that we could formalize a revised payment arrangement rather than demand immediate repayment. Brian would have to acknowledge the remaining obligation. No more pretending it had become an investment. No more silence. The monthly payment could be structured at a level the company had a realistic chance of handling. If he agrees, Richard said, you gain something more valuable than an aggressive demand. What accountability? That was exactly what I wanted. Then we discussed Westbrook. Richard would update records and make sure notices, statements, and relevant LLC communications came directly to me. My 40% interest would be treated like what it was, mine, not Brian's future asset. Not a placeholder for his inheritance, mine. "What about my estate plan?" I asked. Richard looked at me carefully. "Do you want to disinherit him?" "No." The answer came immediately. "Then don't make estate decisions while you're angry. I don't want to punish him after I'm dead either." "Good. But I do want everything reviewed, that I strongly recommend." We agreed that nothing in my estate documents should allow Brian to assume he had present control over assets simply because he might inherit later. When I left Richard's office, I felt lighter. Not happy. Clear. There is relief in finally understanding that a boundary doesn't need to be cruel to be firm. 2 days later, Brian and Rachel came back to my house. This time they brought no dealership folder, no brochure, no solution for my life. Brian looked exhausted. Rachel looked embarrassed. I made coffee. Then we sat at the kitchen table where so much damage had already been done. I placed Richard's proposed repayment arrangement in front of Brian. He read the first page, then the second. "You're not demanding the full balance, no." His eyes lifted. "I thought you would. I could make things much harder for you than I'm choosing to." He looked down. "I know. But don't confuse mercy with forgetting." "I won't. You already did once." That landed. He nodded. I pointed toward the agreement. "You will acknowledge the debt." "Yes." "You will make payments according to the new schedule." "Yes." "If the company has another serious problem, you talk to me before simply stopping." He swallowed. "Okay. And you stop calling it an investment." Brian looked ashamed. "It was easier." "What was calling it that?" I waited. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper. "If I called it a loan, then every time I talked about Dad helping me, I had to remember I hadn't finished paying him back. There it was. Not an excuse. A confession." I nodded. "Then start remembering." He signed. When the pen left the paper, I felt no triumph, just closure around one open wound. Then I brought out the Westbrook documents. Brian visibly tensed. I'm not taking the building away from your company. His shoulders loosened slightly. But my ownership is being formally protected and updated. He nodded. You will not represent yourself as sole owner. I haven't. You've represented the future as though it were guaranteed. He looked down. That's fair. You will not make plans based on my 40% without discussing them with me. Understood. And my estate plan is being reviewed. His eyes rose. I could see the question. Am I still inheriting it? He didn't ask. That mattered. I don't know what will happen to my share after I die, I said. Maybe some will go to you. Maybe all of it. Maybe circumstances will change. Brian remained silent. But from this day forward, you do not make financial decisions based on waiting for something that belongs to a living person. I understand. I looked directly at him. Do you? Yes. Rachel reached into her purse. She placed the Lexus key on the table. The original key. I should have returned this weeks ago. I picked it up. Thank you. The dealership deposit has been cancelled, and the crossover, someone else can buy it. What are you doing for a car? Rachel almost smiled. I found a used Toyota that's 4 years old. Brian glanced at her. She hates the color. I do hate the color. For the first time in weeks I laughed. So did Rachel. The tension loosened for a moment. Then her face became serious. Alice, I owe you an apology. I waited. I liked your car. I know. I liked how clients looked at me when I stepped out of it. And when Brian said you didn't really need it, I accepted that because it benefited me. She looked down. I should have asked myself why my need mattered more than yours. I appreciated that she didn't say if I hurt you. She knew she had. Thank you. Brian remained quiet. I turned toward him. He looked at me. I'm sorry too. For what? His face tightened. For the car. That's part of it. I know. He struggled. For treating your things like they were already. He stopped. Already what? Partly mine. The words seemed painful for him. I don't know when I started thinking that way. I think your father did. Brian looked toward Edward's study. I wish he'd said something. He did. To me, I don't know. Maybe you weren't ready to hear it. That hurt him. I could see it. But sometimes truth hurts without being cruel. Brian looked at the repayment agreement. What happens if I can't save the company? You make the responsible decisions a business owner has to make. You won't rescue me. The question sounded almost childlike. I took a breath. I will always be your mother. That isn't what I asked. No. His eyes filled slightly. I continued. I will listen. I will care. If you are in genuine trouble, I won't enjoy watching you suffer. But I am not going to keep sacrificing pieces of my life so you can avoid changing yours. He nodded slowly. The silence that followed was painful but necessary. After a while, Brian stood. At the door, he stopped. Mom. Yes. Do you think you'll ever trust me again? I looked at my son. The easiest answer would have been yes. Mothers are expected to make pain disappear quickly, but I had done enough pretending. I think I can. His expression softened. But not because you're my son. He frowned. Then why? Because of what you do next. I walked closer. Trust isn't inherited either, Brian. His eyes dropped. You rebuild it. He nodded. Then he left. I watched Brian and Rachel drive away in his truck. My Lexus remained in my driveway. My keys were in my hand. My house was still mine. My future was still unwritten. And strangely, I didn't feel as though I had defeated anyone. I had simply stopped surrendering. Edward had left me documents that could have become weapons. Instead, I had used them as boundaries. Brian still had his company. He still had an opportunity to repair his marriage. And if he wanted it, he still had a relationship with me. But for the first time, that relationship would have to exist, without the assumption that loving his mother meant having access to everything she owned. I looked down at the Lexus key. Then I remembered Brian's question. Would I ever trust him again? I hoped so. But hope was no longer going to substitute for proof. After everything was settled, I moved it to a safe deposit box. The trunk returned to being a trunk. Groceries, library books, an umbrella, a blanket, ordinary things. For months I had thought the title of this chapter of my life would be about what Edward had locked beneath that trunk floor. An $85,000 promissory note, ownership documents, proof. Those things mattered. They protected me when memory, grief, and family expectations became tangled. But eventually, I understood that the most important thing Edward left in that compartment wasn't legal paperwork. It was a boundary. A reminder that generosity is still generosity only when the person giving it has a choice. That love does not erase ownership. That getting older does not make your life communal property. And that an inheritance belongs to the future, not to the person waiting for it. Brian learned that lesson painfully. So did I. Because I had helped create part of the problem. Every time I said yes because saying no felt unmotherly, I taught my son that my boundaries were flexible. Every time he said, "Let me handle it," and I surrendered a decision I was capable of making, I made his control feel like care. Neither of us noticed when the line moved. Until he took my car. 3 days. That was all I had agreed to. 3 days became 3 weeks. A favor became an assumption became a plan. And the plan led us straight to everything our family had refused to talk about. Money, inheritance, grief, entitlement, fear. Maybe that was why I no longer hated what happened. I hated being hurt. I hated discovering how Brian had been thinking. But sometimes the conflict that threatens a family is also the one that forces it to become healthier. That evening I stopped at an overlook near the James River. I parked the Lexus and watched the late sunlight stretch across the water. For a moment I imagined Edward sitting beside me. He would have complained that I was wasting gas. Then he would have asked whether I had called Brian. I smiled. I did. I whispered. A woman walking past probably thought I was talking to myself. Maybe I was. I stayed until the sky began turning pink. Then I started the car. Before pulling away, I rested my hands on the steering wheel. Edward had bought me that Lexus because he wanted me safe. For years I thought safety meant having something strong around me. A reliable car, a paid-off house, savings, documents. But I know better now. Real safety also means knowing where you end and someone else begins. Knowing that you can love your children without surrendering yourself to them. Knowing that no is a complete sentence even when the person hearing it calls you mom. Brian thought Rachel needed my car more than I did. Maybe she did need transportation more urgently. That was never the point. Need does not create ownership, love does not create permission, and someday does not mean today. I shifted into drive. Then I went wherever I wanted.